In the high-stakes world of cybersecurity, where trust and verify isn't just a mantra, it's a way of life, how do you build teams that do more than survive? They flourish. Today, we're sitting down with Dustin Ingalls, the most courageous and caring leader I've had the honor to work for. I met Dustin when he was leading a Microsoft startup in Boston. In fact, we were so startup, our office was in a brownstone on Melcher Street, and their servers almost fell through the floor. Because of our success, Dustin led the first product team in Microsoft's New England Research and Development Center, the Nerd Center, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Dustin taught me sharing vulnerability first is a superpower, and it's important to continually challenge the tech industry's status quo. Get ready for an unfiltered look at what it actually takes to build powerful, connected teams in today's workplace, where authenticity isn't a buzzword, it's the foundation for real change. This is the Nuance Podcast, where we embrace the truths that shape our lives. So when you think about the type of people that either flourish in cyber or what you look for in cyber or what you love about people in cyber, what are some of those traits?
I think a big one is people who love to solve puzzles. Right? Because I always describe working in InfoSec as playing 3D chess, right? You're constantly engaged in learning and anticipating what others are going to do, what your weaknesses might be, and it absolutely quenches that thirst for learning. Because the one thing you can be sure of in the cyber world is things will change constantly.
Yeah.
So it's never boring. It can, to your earlier point, I think it's for certain personalities thrive there. Yeah. Certain personalities. If you felt like the stability of the financial industry was sitting on your shoulders, that might be a bit overpowering. And I think someone who looks at it that way may have a tougher time in that world. But someone who's just thinking of it as just a set of puzzles, a set of fun problems to solve, especially, something that you're doing with a bunch of like-minded colleagues working together, it can be a lot of fun.
Right. So we have a mutual friend, Jesse Miriam, who I know worked in cyber as well. And I remember when Jess and I would go to restaurants and, when the server comes out and they're like, don't touch the plate, it's too hot. What do you think Jesse did? Without even
he would
thinking.
Test it. He would test it.
Like the thumb would come out. Like I'll be the judge of that.
Yeah.
And I feel like there are those kind of quirks of people who work in cyber, and I don't know how to explain it, but it's kind of this. It seems to be like a need to either push boundaries, or it's like they're not going to be told what to do and just do it. Is that a fair assumption? I mean, that's a sweeping generalization, but
no. I think
I say this as a compliment.
I think it is. I think it is someone who very much operates on the notion of trust but verify.
Trust but verify.
Yes.
I like that.
If my wife was here, she would correct me and say there's no such thing as trust and then verify. But
why is that?
Because the whole point of trust is you actually trust it. I think in the security world, it's your responsibility to just be sure. I've generally found that in areas where the cost of failure is high, you'll tend to draw more people that verify. Fair. Right? And whether that's following a checklist, whether that's, double checking certain things, or in the case of security, always somebody said that was patched, but if I can't see the data, I got to be able to verify that because, again, the cost of being wrong
right.
Can be high.
I'm curious to know how you create these environments where people who are the people who grab the plate, who aren't the people who are just going to kind of do what they're told. They're going to challenge thinking. They are critical thinkers. They have a bias for action. They like to move fast. They're very smart. How do you create these environments where these people become so close that they actually take pride in being a member of these teams, even long after you've gone?
I think a big part of it is just creating teams where you can be your authentic self. For me, especially at this point in my career, I have this philosophy of if it's not fun, it's not worth doing. And I think, a lot of people find themselves on teams that are more churn and burn style.
Right.
And that's not fun.
It's definitely not.
And I think, I've had the incredible fortune of being able to work for some great leaders that did exactly that, that created environments that were super fun, the kind of environment where you can work hard, really have an impact, a meaningful impact, one that you can go home and feel good about. But then just also be having fun and feeling like you're working with true, ultimately, friends, as opposed to just other people on the team. It's meaningful.
It's meaningful, but I think a lot of people would ask, like, how do you do that in a way that scales, right? So I think, there are a lot of, we've all worked in those teams where there's like the forced socialization event, like a pizza party or like let's go ice skating or just something or like a potluck, like a super awkward potluck or something. And it's like, this is a cultural experience. We're going to build culture, and it falls short, right? And so I think what's powerful is, I agree with you. I think that you actually do create teams where people become friends in the process. Even though they come from very different backgrounds, they may have wildly different views. And I would argue that some of my best friends actually came out of work experiences. But how do you think that happens? Like, how do you create organic, authentic fun?
Yeah. Well, I think one big part of it is just creating environments where people can truly get to know each other, right? Because in so many business environments, people get to know each other through incidents or escalations. You get that mail from that person that says, hey, I need you to get to this in 3 days. And that's not a way to build a relationship. Not only is it not a way to build a relationship, but you tend to have, at times, conscious or unconscious, negative associations with that because, hey, the only time I ever run into this person is when something's wrong.
And they need something.
And I don't know anything about this person. Flip side of that is somebody that you've met personally, somebody that you've spent FaceTime with, someone that you know some things about, and that person knows things about you, makes it much more personal, makes it much harder to just assume the worst, right? Because we've all had that, hey, I've never met this person. I've just seen their name in a meeting or in an email.
Right.
And it's very easy to think that their motivations aren't great, or that, they're not on your side. But then when you get to know people personally, it humanizes it, right? And it's a lot harder to make those assumptions when you know things about someone, when you've had personal interactions with somebody. When it comes to the team itself, you're absolutely right. Everybody can see through things that are contrived.
Yeah.
Right. If it's, everybody's seen the morale events. I think, a great example. Here's a great example of a bad morale event. Let's go to a movie premiere. Right? It's
all
like,
sit in the dark,
yeah, that
in
really,
separate chairs.
Yeah,
Brilliant.
exactly. It sounds really, really
Love
cool.
it.
And how much of that interaction and getting to know people and learning about people takes place?
Right.
Very little. But creating opportunities where people really get to share things about themselves. More importantly, non-work things. I think that tends to draw people closer together and makes people feel more comfortable surfacing ideas on, hey, here's how we can have fun. And I think the other thing here, I don't think people consciously think about this a lot, but if you're working a full-time job, you spend more time, like more elapsed awake time with your work colleagues than anyone else in your life. So it's kind of this weird inversion where, people sink so much effort into curating personal relationships at home,
right,
but don't think about that same thing at work, even though they're spending more face-to-face time with these people and oftentimes depend on these other people for their personal success.
And I think that dependence is important too. And I think, as you were talking, I wonder if it's about just being actively engaged as a leader and figuring out how you do connect with people first. And the reason I bring this up is because I know when we were working in Cambridge, you had your one-on-ones with all of us, and I believe you had them in different venues for all of us. I know that for us, for you and I in our one-on-ones, it was at a bar, and we would have a shot of Captain's to start, because back in the day, that was my drink of choice. I've since grown up from there, but I think what I'm bringing up is because we would have our one-on-ones never in your office. We would go to like a bar in Boston, and it was our time. It put me in an environment where I felt, okay, this is a guy that sees me because he also knows I love Captain.
Yeah, I think it's, you've heard me say this time and time again. Good judgment comes from experience, and experience comes from bad judgment. I have a lot of experience, and just in those experiences, nearly all the things you shouldn't do as a manager, I've done at some point. And
way to own it.
Gotten schooled on why that doesn't work, why that, is not a great practice. And as I said before, I've had the opportunity to work for some really cool leaders that showed me. One of the first leaders to truly make a difference in my life, I'll never forget this meeting where there was this big escalation, and he was kind of the main senior guy, and he could have made this entire thing go away with just a flick of his finger. But instead, he goes into this meeting and he just sits there and he doesn't say a word. So basically, the other side of this escalation is just thundering away at me this entire time. And this thing went on and on and on, and finally got done with it. And then after the meeting, I was kind of frustrated. I was like, hey, why didn't you say anything?
Yeah,
like, why didn't you help? Why didn't you do anything? And he just sort of ignored that comment, and he said, hey, so why did you use this phrase when you were trying to make this point? And how do you think it made that person feel, and all this kind of stuff? I was super frustrated because instead of, my perception or expectation was he was there to support me, to help me, to help address this escalation.
Right.
And he didn't do anything to participate in the discussion, and I was super frustrated. And eventually it finally dawned on me what he was doing. Like, he had complete trust and faith in me,
right,
that I was going to prevail in that escalation. So instead, he wanted to focus on my style and approach, and ended up giving me feedback that I had never gotten before around how I was delivering the message and the impact that it was having. Were there better ways to deliver the message, etc.? That made a huge impression on me, because, before then, I'd always thought that, hey, you're just there to help win the day, to help push the ball across the line. That he was the first to really teach me that your job as a leader is to help develop other people and make them successful. It's ironically, it's a little like parenting, right? Because if you do things for your kid,
right,
they're disempowered and they don't end up learning how to do things. But if you instead let them do it on their own, don't interfere, let them take reasonable risks, let them fail, but then give them thoughts, feedback, and be a sounding board for questions along the way, they just turn out much stronger, much more empowered. And the same is true of, I think people don't realize how little feedback or coaching or anything goes on day to day. So people are just white knuckling it the whole time. And this was the first leader that really showed me how deeply important. In fact, he would say the most important part of his job was not driving direct business results. It was building a powerful and effective leadership team. And that turns out to be one of the most important ingredients to scalable leadership.
I think I love that for so many reasons. And it actually made me think, I think what you just said is it. Back to what we were talking about before, like, how do you create these environments? Because when I think about when I work for you, when we all work for you, I can't think of a time where if there was a conflict between our team and another team, or if, I don't know, I was trespassed against in some way, I can't remember a time that you ever, like, in a meeting kind of acted like, this was your fiefdom, this was your team, and you were going to basically be like the hero of the meeting and back all of us. But I always felt like you had my back. And so as you were talking, I was trying to figure out, why did I feel that way when you didn't do kind of, I think, what many of us hope for, like maybe in our 20s and we're not that mature. And we're like, my boss has my back when they speak up for me in meetings, or when they basically take the fight on for me so I don't have to. And I think, when you're younger, you're like, the more that I work and the more that I'm valued, my boss will show me how much I'm valued by how much they have my back and how much they're willing to like put their political capital on the line for me. And what I learned working for you in Cambridge was that you always had my back, in the sense that I always had a safe environment to be operating from. It was an open environment where I usually could anticipate what was going to be happening in meetings, because I could talk about it before with anyone on the team, including you. I could get advice in advance. And then you did give feedback in those weekly meetings. For us, it was over Captain and Coke. So it wasn't like, here is feedback hour, or like in our annual review. It wasn't like, and now we're going to get to the feedback. It just was kind of a natural way of talking. But I think you were very much like a coach. Not whether it's a coach or it's, musical theater or someone who's running that. I think as you were talking about teaching people, I'll never forget one time, I wasn't sure if someone was basically being shady or if they were being manipulative. I mean, the word now would be gaslighting, I guess. And I was upset. And I remember it was maybe like around 5 or something, because it was dark out. And I remember coming to your office and I'm like, look, I was trying to figure out, how do I assert myself back to let this person know, like, don't fuck with me. And you were like, yeah. And you do that thing where you grab your badge and your lanyard, you start like fidgeting with it. And you were just like, listen, at the end of the day, you don't know, right, at all. And even if that person is gaslighting you or manipulating you, it doesn't change your approach. And I'll never forget this, because you were right. It doesn't, whether or not that person's a snake, or that person really was just misunderstood, or I misunderstood something, the approach that I have to take is, as a leader, I have to seek to understand, instead of try to go in there and show people that I have power too.
I think it was just learning what works and what doesn't. And to that point about, always take the same approach and be curious. At the end of the day, one of the most important superpowers for success in any large organization is the ability to have influence without authority.
Right.
People try to do things through force. It may happen once, but it won't happen again with the same set of people. Like, that's just not a way people like working.
Right.
And when they see that, they tend to think of that person as, a bull in a china shop, forceful, intimidating, and it's just, people won't want to collaborate with you. And that makes it hard to be successful. Even if you, the problem is, in the vast majority of cases, people doing that have great intentions. They believe they're just being true to their mission.
Right.
But they don't realize the difference between the battle and the war. If you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, you got to go together. And the way you go together is by surrounding yourself with people that enjoy working with you, that trust you, that want to work together and know that if they throw in with you, that they're going to benefit and everybody's going to be successful.
Well, and let's build on that, right? Because you could easily take a phrase like go together with people as consensus-driven, fear-based decision-making. And I don't think that's what you're saying.
No. If it's fear-based, people will leave. You're not going to be together very long.
Yeah.
And I think, we've seen this a bunch. Fear-based leadership is very time-limited. And people like that develop a reputation pretty darn fast.
Yeah, that's true.
So,
and then in terms of going back to this idea too of building powerful teams, there's a responsibility on every team member to also build a powerful team too, right? And I wonder how much of a role humor plays in all this. So I know, like in our teams that we work together on, everyone has their quirks. It's no secret. I have ADHD. Everyone's got their strengths, and everyone's got their super strengths, and every strength causes its own shadow at some point. But when everyone kind of knows each other's quirks, or their shortfalls, or their idiosyncrasies, or what causes like their triggers, their angst, when you can poke fun at it, I think it just is like all out in the open. And so, I used to joke, like in your war meetings, like barbs of love was the phrase I think that was used. But they were like barbs of love, because I think it allowed us to be honest. It allowed us to give feedback and look out for each other, because it was like, dude, like we both know that you struggle with this and I'm trying to jump ahead of this. So it was almost like when people would give you feedback or when they would try to help you be successful, you didn't really question where they were coming from because we all kind of knew each other's like strengths. But I guess I do wonder how much teasing and humor plays a role in keeping people together and moving forward quickly and looking out for one another.
In my experience, it plays a significant role for two reasons. One, I think humor is a way of making people feel at ease. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. If you're joking around with me, if you're being funny, if you're being light, it probably means you're not mad, you're not upset, things are okay. So you kind of derive a little bit of safety from the fact that, your colleague is, trying to make things funny, fun, etc. But it is also a sign that people feel comfortable being authentic. And that is the most important thing, because people in general will gravitate to where they feel comfortable being authentic, because trying to have that cover on, trying to code switch, trying to do any of those things is exhausting.
It really is.
It takes really a lot of effort. And when we come back to you spend more time here, more waking hours here than anywhere else in your life. It's hard. It takes its toll. And I think people realize that pretty quickly. And humor is just a fun way of letting the safe authenticity out.
Well, and I feel seen. When you're teased about something that is a vulnerability, people really do know you. And, for better or for worse, sometimes people can take teasing too far. But again, I think people have an uncanny ability to recognize intent.
The leader's job to create a safe environment for that. Because people, I think, oftentimes have experiences that generally dissuade them from leading off with their authentic self. They need to assess the team, assess the area, and figure out if that's okay. But again, when you're operating in that mode, there's a number of things that go wrong. There's a cognitive load with having to, not be yourself. It takes work. It takes mental cycles. But it also means you may not say the thing you want to say. And that's really what becomes the most important part. That's why, just from a leadership perspective, why people who recognize this focus so hard on authenticity, because oftentimes either the best ideas, or, and this really rears its head in security, people who are comfortable being authentic are comfortable saying, hey, this is messed up. Yeah. Like, there's a real risk here. We're going to be in trouble. And what you don't ever want, especially in an area like security, is people who don't feel comfortable saying that, hey, there's something wrong here. And it also, of course, makes a big difference when people are trying to be creative, because oftentimes, especially if you work at large companies, there's a lot of people there, there's a lot of ideas, and there's a lot of history. So people get used to doing things a certain way. And when you have a new person show up who feels comfortable being authentic, they're the one that's going to ask the question that other people don't ask because they're so used to doing things a certain way, that actually leads to a big change. Mm-hmm. A lot of people, this also relates to innovation, because a lot of people assume that innovation is, I invented flux capacitors. Sometimes innovation is, I just invented a much, much better way of doing the same thing. Much faster, much more reliable, much safer, whatever the case may be. But that usually requires different ideas, things people haven't thought of before. And it's risky, especially for a new person, to suggest ideas that aren't consistent with the existing culture or the existing way you do things. And if you can create an environment where that is deeply encouraged, then you're going to get a lot more of these unique ideas and things that haven't been suggested before. And those teams will inevitably progress faster.
Right. So you're a white man, Dustin. I am not. And when we worked together, there were a lot of white guys on the team who I looked nothing like. And I never felt like, let's say that someone had just said something stupid or something happened to me on the way to work. You know, someone called me the N-word or something that just like threw me off. I never felt like I couldn't just go into work and be like, oh, what the fuck? Like, I hate people. Like, I didn't feel like I could just walk in, get it out of my system, and just get back to work. And I think that, you know, when you work on startups, you don't always have the luxury of like sitting around and processing your feelings. So I do think that I learned early in my career in tech that if I was distracted, it was actually going to get in the way of my performance. But when you start to think about like, you know, race, all of the isms, you start to think about people's backgrounds, people struggling with like neurodivergence, you know, depression, like mental, all of that is becoming real and more top of mind. And I never felt like we couldn't just actually talk about that almost like off the cuff, because it was something that I was dealing with. Just like I can talk about a breakup, I can talk about being Black. And I'm curious to know if you have any thoughts as to why that seemed just like such a natural thing to do on your team, when you know that, you know, it's a real challenge for a lot of people to feel like they can talk about the issues that they're dealing with that maybe everyone else at the table has never even experienced and does not know what to say back.
I think that's a byproduct of creating that environment where people feel safe. What I've learned, like many others, I've been through some tough experiences in my life. And one of the unexpected byproducts of some of the hardest experiences I've been through is finding out what happens when I share vulnerability with others. Being vulnerable feels risky.
Well, it is
to the person who's being vulnerable, 100%. But what I learned, and you know, this is one of those things that in hindsight you're like, well, of course. But what I learned is being vulnerable gives others permission to be vulnerable. I have learned so much about people that I never expected to learn after being vulnerable and sharing. And so you asked a question earlier about how I build these teams. One of the very first and most important things I do is lead with vulnerability. I start off and I really got this lesson sent home to me the other day when I was doing an all-staff meeting and, you know, talking to a lot of people that I hadn't talked to before, and just decided to tell people that I've been in therapy for the last 2.5 years, and it's been one of the greatest things in my life. Because, you know, there's this stigma with mental health, and the idea, even though the idea of preventative medicine, you know, going in and getting a checkup is as normal can be, getting a mental checkup is, ooh, there's something wrong with you. And given the incredible stress that people are under, and of course in the security world, you know, there's some unique stressors there as well.
Yeah, for sure.
It's important to me personally to sort of at least try to normalize that it's okay to not be okay, that it's okay to do these things. So nonetheless, you know, I kind of threw this story in the end about, you know, how much I've experienced a divorce in the last 2.5 years and just massive life changes. And that's what, you know, got me to where I started therapy. And I thought because it had such a positive impact on my life, I just wanted to share that about myself, which is a little unusual to just kind of lead in a large meeting with, hey, I'm in therapy. The number of people that sent mails afterwards thanking me that they never imagined a leader would say that in a large audience.
Yeah.
Really surprised me. And it was just a reminder how important this is to just keep, because people, you know, like at Microsoft, they talk about, you know, this notion of model, coach, and care. But in any kind of leadership training, and even with parenting, they tell you, like, you have to lead by example.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is the amount of lead by example from a human focused,
Right.
vulnerability focused
Right.
perspective isn't nearly as common in the workplace as it needs to be. But it is through doing that, I think, that once you lead with vulnerability, if the leader can be vulnerable, it makes it more likely that others will feel comfortable being vulnerable. And once you kind of normalize that it's okay to be vulnerable, I think you get that type of team where it's okay to just walk into the office and let off some serious steam about some crazy stuff that just happened to you, and then say, back to our regularly scheduled program.
Excuse me all while I have a moment. But I think I think what's interesting there, because remember when like being vulnerable became like the catchphrase and it kind of hit, mainstream LinkedIn, if you will. And I remember even at Microsoft, I think there was actually some type of a program or something where all of the directors in their all hands or something had to or in their leadership team meetings, they had to everyone had to go. It was like a round table where you all had to share something that was vulnerable. And it was so awkward. And it was just as cringy as you can imagine that it would be. And again, maybe that just goes back to being contrived. But I think there's a difference, right, between like bitching about something in your life or your feelings being hurt and being vulnerable.
Yes.
So what is it you think that kind of tips it over into real vulnerability that makes people feel like they want to, they want to show you love and trust because you went first versus, my boyfriend's an idiot and I got called a name and I just feel bad about it. Because I think a lot of people complain. And
sure.
I think you do it because you're like, oh, I want to be human and I don't want to share, my feelings and I'm being vulnerable. And I'm like, I don't know why, but that doesn't feel vulnerable to me. What do you think it is that actually makes it vulnerable?
When there's personal risk involved.
Okay. And I think people can pick up on that.
Yeah, 100%. Because
that's a great way to put it.
In that contrived group you were talking about, trying to think of, oh, wow, I did this when I was in elementary school,
so
or I
awkward.
did this, those are just not the things. Like, that's not real vulnerability. Showing up and saying, look, I really struggle with imposter syndrome. Like, I don't feel like I belong here yet.
Mm-hmm.
That's vulnerable. Right?
Because there's blood in the water.
There's a risk that when you say that other people are going to look at you and say, you're right, you don't belong here.
So glad you brought that up.
And I think that's an example. I think also just, especially, it's funny, you talk about white males.
Let's talk about white males.
White males that I'm familiar with that have grown up in a culture similar to mine, etc., are sort of taught that vulnerability is bad.
Mm-hmm.
Vulnerability is weakness. That you can't show vulnerability because it will be exploited. So, and I think you see this. You talk about some of the tech bro stereotypes, and you talk about new white male engineers, and you see these kinds of things. You see this at times. This overwhelming drive to prove yourself, which
it's just become so comical. With one in particular yesterday, I was like, why is this person wearing a gold Flavor Flav medallion? And what are we doing now? We're bringing 90s hip hop into the tech bro scene. Why is this provocative? What is happening? What do you have to prove? So weird. The insecurity is palpable.
Yeah, it's you look at that and you see, and eventually you realize that person is deeply afraid of being vulnerable. And, and you come back to that authenticity thing. Imagine bringing that deep fear into the workplace.
Oh, yeah.
You're back to being exhausted again. How do you apply your best mental cycles towards changing the world if you're so preoccupied with trying to put this fake cover on because you don't want anyone to see your vulnerability? And that is hard.
I feel like fear is very contagious. It really is, because I think the minute you see somebody else be aware of the fact that they are unsafe, you become heightened. Like your awareness becomes heightened. Like, well, what are they worried
you
about?
assume if they're afraid for a reason.
They know something I don't know.
And you must have missed it, so you better be afraid as well. Yes, 100%.
Right, and it cripples teams so fast. And that's how you end up in situations where like people are checking bugs, into the code, and they're not saying anything about it because for whatever reason they saw someone else do it, and that person's smart, and so I'm new, and so if I'm seeing someone else do that, I'm going to do it too. And it always, shows up in the end. It always affects the product. And I just feel like insecurity ruins everything. I mean, in life, insecurity ruins everything. It ruins cultures, it ruins companies, it ruins products, nations, global warming. No, but I think, I do wonder, this idea of being insecure and this idea of being so afraid. The reason I bring that up with learning is because I don't know why the going in assumption is that you should know everything. When you work in a team of really smart people, if you knew what everyone else knew, then you're working with a bunch of idiots. Like, I feel like, you know what I mean? Like, what's odd to me, right, is this idea that not knowing something is vulnerable when it's like, by design, you shouldn't know what your colleagues really know, because otherwise, what are you both doing here? And so what's really weird to me is where the insecurity comes from, especially when it's like, I have imposter syndrome, or I'm not sure. It's like, well, good, because I am sure about that. You're not, but I'm not sure about this. Like, why isn't it just kind of assumed that we don't know everything?
If only everyone could be that logical.
But it is so logical. I think that's why I'm like, I don't know why we're so afraid. Is it because it really is weaponized a lot, or are we just being irrational?
I think people in general, like, and this is one of these things where you have to come back to, everybody has insecurity. Everybody does.
Oh, for sure.
And the people who look the least insecure may sometimes be the most insecure, but everybody has it. One important thing to recognize is there's just this natural human tendency to see the best in others and to see the flaws in yourself.
That's true.
That's everybody does that. And when you
I
bring
think everyone's
that,
always surprised to hear that. You're like, really?
When you bring that into a professional environment, that's where the fear begins, right? Because you only see the superstar status of those around you. You see what they're accomplishing. You see where they came from, and you see what they're doing.
How masterful they are at articulating what they do. Yeah.
You're not aware of any of their flaws, but you're deeply aware of your own. So there's a scoring that happens in your column that doesn't happen in their column. And if you overthink that, I think that's where a lot of that initial fear comes from. Because you can't see their flaws. They don't have flaws, you do. How can you ever add up? How can you ever be on the same level as them?
How do you overcome that with your peers? I'm asking because we've actually sat around, this kitchen, island with colleagues and former friends and partners, and we've had these actual conversations. How do you get to a place where you could say to someone, that's what you just said, that's how I'm feeling? You just say it and just hope for the best?
Well, wow, that's a really tough one. Once you've been around long enough, part of that is having faith in yourself and just trying to override that fear with your logic, which is, look, everybody on this team is human.
Right.
And even though I don't see their flaws, everyone has an origin story. Like one of my favorite hoodies says on the back, everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about.
You know what's funny is I've seen that phrase, and my first reaction's been like, nah, that's not true. Isn't that like, I instantly want to be like, no, that's not true. There are some people really winning out there. And that's my own insecurity, just like back because even when I see that phrase.
And it's even more, not to get going on a soapbox here.
Let's get on a soapbox.
But that's, social media really drives that point home. Because what you see in social media is people intentionally only showing their best side. So when you, and it didn't start with social media, right? It started with, teen magazines, when even before the times, but it is just when you see stuff online or stuff that's published, it's intentionally curated, right? You're intentionally seeing someone's best side and intentionally suppressing. Yeah.
Like there are full story, like success stories.
Yeah.
Just showing up all over, but not just great pictures.
And it's hard you can't compare yourself against that, but there's this natural motivation too, because it's the only point of reference you have.
Well, it's also it is addictive. I mean, we all know, those of us who build consumer technology are very, very well aware of the psychology behind creating addictive experiences. That is how you keep people engaged in your ecosystem. And so that is brilliantly working right now.
Yeah. Oh boy, I think this is where that modeling and coaching and trying to get people to feel comfortable being authentic, that's why it becomes so important.
Do you think you just have to use more of your words? Like, do you think you just have to be more, it's almost like as a leader, whether it's like you have to just kind of be aware, like you would in any context, right? If your team is going through something or if something's happening that is affecting a couple of team members, you typically go out of your way to make sure that people understand you, or you go out of your way to let people know that you are seeking to understand them or that you are acknowledging them versus just assuming that.
I think it's the latter part of what you said that's the most important.
Which is what?
Making them feel heard.
Mm-hmm.
Making them feel seen. There is nothing more important to feeling comfortable.
Even just understood.
Sure.
Like I might not even feel comfortable, but if I feel understood, like sometimes I feel like I'd rather be understood than even liked. Because there is a comfort that I get with acknowledgement, because acknowledgement is not agreement, it's not acceptance, it's not approval, but I at least feel like you understand what I'm trying to say, because then we can actually take the conversation somewhere constructive.
But it also means if someone makes you feel heard and feel seen, it means you're part of the collective.
How do you
go from the outside to the inside?
But so people say that all the time, right? Your team needs to feel seen. I need to feel seen. He makes me feel seen. How do you, as Dustin Ingalls, go about helping to ensure that people feel seen? Like, what is the extra effort that you put in? Like, what are the non-tangibles?
It's three things. One, leading with my own vulnerabilities. Because when people hear someone that either they look up to or they feel like they have to because they report to them or whatever, when they hear that person has a similar challenge that they do, or a similar defect that they do, or something wrong that is familiar to them, that inevitably creates a bond, right? There's something in common. There's something to build on. The next is there is no substitute for interactive communication, ideally face-to-face.
Tell me more about that. Because, in this world, right, this crazy data-driven, hyper-connected world that we live in, we all feel so much more farther apart.
I mean, all different modes of communication have their time, their place, their strength. But making connection, I think, is only effective when it's interactive on video or in person, ideally in person.
And what do you do? I mean, so even if it's interactive, right? And the reason I'm asking this is because I wonder what role curiosity plays in this. Because how do you make something interactive? I mean, because you can have a lot of in-person moments that are draining, totally exhausting. It feels like it was a waste of your time. It's performance meetings, right? Where you're not actual performance meeting, but like it's just kind of like interactive theater.
Yeah, you're saying performative.
Performative meetings, yes.
Yes. But it's where you make space for people.
Well, this
right?
is important.
It's where you listen to people, because there's a difference between speaking with someone and speaking to someone. Right? Sure.
Yes.
You can go into a meeting and you can just talk at people. But that's not connection.
I think what you're saying is important, and I think it's important to also be very specific about what you mean about like interpersonal, like what this interaction really means for people. And I'm going to share just from my own personal experiences. being a woman of color in an environment where most people don't look like me. Sometimes my hair is my drag. Sometimes my hair is curly. Sometimes it's straight. Sometimes it's in braids. But when I have to be in person as Mary Sharon, it feels often like every meeting I walk into, I'm walking into a wall of energy and everyone is staring. I don't feel that way on Zoom. I remember one particular scenario where a vendor had screwed up on something, and a vendor that I had hired, they were contracted with my team. They had screwed up on something and they needed to fix it. And so we had a meeting the next day, and I'm expecting them to bring their solution. And it is 12 guys sitting around a room. Some other people were, on teams or whatever. And I'm like, what are we waiting for? And this guy goes, we're waiting for Mary Sharon Owens to get here. And I'm like, what would make you think I'm not Mary Sharon Owens? There's one
We're not going to have to wait long.
There's one woman on the meeting request. There's one woman in the room. Holy shit. Like, that is so illuminating, but also like really, it's just overwhelming because I have to then sit there, and I'm supposed to be in a position of power, by the way. Mm-hmm. And it's so wildly offensive that the things I want to say back to you that I know I can't. And then it's like, you kind of have to like quickly get yourself back together and just stay focused on the conversation. But it's not like I'm not furious on the inside. It's not like I didn't drive home that day and have to process that for the next week. That story happened years ago and I still remember it vividly. And my point is, when people are kind of in these in-person moments, they are saying and doing things that can actually affect certain people more maybe than others. And I think unless we really address it, you can't just say that like, interactive, engagement is the best. And the reason I'm saying this is not because what you just said, but because when you think of these like sweeping narratives that are taking place, it seems like the very people who are telling us that we have to get back to the office are the very people who are like, walking into a room and asking me, or you're telling me about like some gangster rap that they listen to. And I'm like, I listen to like you too. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. And I don't know why you're bringing that up to me when I know you wouldn't bring that up to Jeff. So how do we achieve both things, right? Like, how do we make interactive communication and engagement something that actually is positive? And when I mean positive, I don't mean superficially optimistic. I mean like constructive.
I'm going to state the obvious before I start trying to give a long, complex answer.
I will definitely have
I'm giving you the white male, middle-aged manager perspective.
Well, it's the only perspective that matters, so let's hear it.
First of all, it kind of, I think, makes the point a little bit that it's pretty powerful what you just said about you're able to see how much of a story is made up in someone's head before they get the opportunity to connect with someone.
Yes.
Like the reason you were or weren't seen or they thought something or whatever is because they'd never actually connected with you. And just they formed this big story in their head from all of your written communication, right? So they had exchanged emails,
right.
There may have been escalations, and they had this image in their head of this Mary Sharon that's on fire and trying to get stuff done and
leader,
comes in with
senior.
lightning bolts in her hands and all this kind of stuff. And they expect and then they have, based on their own origin story and their own personal life, it forms an image of what does this powerful person look like. Right. And you end up looking different. And as such, they just blow it. So, I mean, at the risk of sounding obvious, I think this is part of why there has to be a way to have more connected communication, more intentional communication to begin with.
And
right?
I think I agree with you.
Because if the first meeting you ever had with them was a video meeting, they would know exactly who Mary Sharon is before they had an opportunity to try and form a view from this written thing. Or
if they've heard about me and then they're like, you're Mary Sharon?
Oh yeah. Everybody.
Gosh, that's not the way that I heard you. Everybody's
guilty of this. Like you can't not do it.
Right.
When I get an escalation from somebody I've never met before, like your mind just naturally tries just to make it just to make your response more effective, you try to form this persona to fill in the gaps. You have to, there's just this natural need. There's a discomfort with uncertainty, so you got to fill in the gaps. The second part, and this is going to be probably more controversial, but there's this book out there called The 4 Agreements.
Oh, sure.
That I learned so much from.
Really?
And it's a fascinating book. It's a short, easy read. I would recommend it to anybody. It's kind of funky because it has, some interesting foundations in it that have nothing to do with the message.
Okay.
But 2 of the 4 agreements I live by every day, and it is, people ask me, like, how did you get through that?
Yeah.
Like, how did you get through that meeting? How did you get through that thing? And I always tell them, have you read this book? The 2 most important agreements are, don't make assumptions, and don't take things personally because it's not about you.
Yeah.
And that is the hardest one.
It is.
That is the hardest one.
That is the hardest one to really believe.
Because that high-fiving white guy that tried to anticipate what your musical taste might be was coming from a position of insecurity. He was trying to make an impression on you, which pissed you off because you're like, you don't have the right to make assumptions about me. But that's what people do. It's all part of that trying to fill in the blanks. And likely is not. I'm not saying, I want to be careful here. It doesn't justify
No,
the
I
behavior.
don't think you're like making an excuse for this person.
But the origin of it is this person wants to fit in, wants to make a connection.
Well, I think right there.
And
they want to make a connection.
And it's, whatever story they filled in, it's about them. It's not actually about you. It feels very personal because they tried to anticipate something about you that was wrong. But this don't take it personally because that thing that happened was about them, not about you. That has been one of the most helpful, effective things for me in getting through high conflict situations, difficult situations, etc.
And I don't think what you're saying is that I should just like dismiss what feels very real for me, right? Because I think what's tricky though is, and you hear this a lot, with like women affinity groups too. Like when people are making these assumptions about me that are derogatory, they're making very good assumptions about other people who may not deserve those good assumptions either.
Sure.
And so every time someone says a microaggression to me, that's where my brain starts going like, because it's not like, I mean, for the most part, the comments that are made to me, the assumptions that are made, there is absolutely a theme that is disappointing. Like, I mean, even I was on a board, and a woman on the board was from Ireland. My mom's Irish, as you know. And I said, oh, like my mom's Irish and, my family's from County Kerry. And she's like, oh, and she's like, I hope you can make it there one day. Ireland's beautiful. Like, no offense. Like, I just remember sitting there and everyone kind of kept talking. And I'm like, first of all, it was like, what makes you think as a grown woman who's worked for like Fortune 50 companies that I haven't made it to Ireland? That's what I mean. It's like, it wasn't even like, oh, have you been? In her mind, that couldn't possibly be the case. I don't know why. I mean, I don't know why Ireland is such a exclusive place, but that's the kind of thing where you just sit there and you're like, as much as I would love to say that that wasn't about me, I do know that it was about her.
Yeah.
But what affects me is the fact that I know when so many people think these things about me in an organization or in a system, it's going to hold me back.
Yeah.
And I can't so it's like when I get passed over. It's not fair.
It's not fair.
And it's also very, very hard for one person to feel like they can fight back.
Yeah.
Because in a large organization, when I'm talking, and then that same woman, of course, like, by the way, this was a board for like women in technology. So it's like, it's really hard when I see women doing it. Cause I'm like, really? How would you like it if some guy said something like, and they can't see it.
Right.
And so I think what's hard is the reason I'm bringing all this up is because when I have to have these interactive moments at work, it's every meeting. It's not like it happens once a week.
Yeah.
It's like I had that board meeting at 7 a.m. Then someone talked to me about like a gangster rapper in the middle of the day. And then someone makes an assumption about the fact that I'm going to go home and see my mom or my dad for Christmas because my parents can't clearly be together. It's just constant. and I'm not even going to get into the hair. I'm not even going to go there on this. But I think it's like the questions that people ask you, it's like here's what it is. I feel like in order to be successful as a minority in business, is I have to be constantly aware of how I come across. And it's like unrelenting. Like I don't get to take a break from that. And when I see people just so casually being offensive because they know that it doesn't really matter if they're offensive or not, that's what gets you. And so I'm bringing this up not because I need you to solve it, but because I know you well enough to know that when you say it's important for us all to be together in person, I want people to understand that I think that that's not just like a platitude for you.
No.
And I think what you really mean is, actually, Mary Sharon, I think the solve is if we were together in person, if we were having Captain and Cokes every Friday, at some point I might be like, girl, why don't you think I've been to Ireland? What are you talking about? I think that's what you're saying.
100%. Because in that kind of environment, you will feel more comfortable calling someone out. Like that's how you know you have an authentic high trust environment, is when people call each other out on a regular basis. And let me be clear, like there's a constructive way to call somebody out, and there's a crappy way to call somebody out. But
right.
in a high trust environment, like you should be able to say, hey, I know you probably didn't mean it that way, but what you said there was deeply offensive. Because you made an assumption about me that you didn't have a right to make.
It's to have a right that is, I'm glad that you say it like that, because that's actually what is so offensive is like, you don't know me.
Yeah.
How dare you?
Yeah.
And again, if you said it that way, you'd be seen as so dramatic or like, oh, it's not a big deal. It's like, because it's not a big deal to you because you're not dealing with, families that are coming from Jim Crow. You're not dealing with the aftermath of all of these systematic little cuts.
Right.
And so every time you're still making systematic cuts, I keep thinking about how hard it was for my grandma, how hard it was. That's where my head goes in the middle of a meeting where we're supposed to be talking about like IT strategy. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is how do we foster a richer conversation around this part? Because even to build on what you're saying, right? And I know what you mean, by the way, and I fully support it and agree with it. But there are a lot of women, especially after, this last election, that are like, it is not my damn job to educate you anymore. Go to Google. And of course, I wish that were true. Unfortunately, it's going to be my job for the rest of my life to educate people only because I have to pay my bills. So I'm always going to have to be doing probably a little bit extra. And that still feels unfair and it sucks. And so I think what we're saying, I think jointly saying is, I don't think the answer is to get further and further apart.
No.
I don't think the answer is to literally put up screens and barriers in between us so that I don't have to deal with you as much as I used to.
Yeah. When feeling less connected feels more comfortable.
That's a great way to put it.
That's the beginning of the end.
That is the beginning of problems. But I think, how do you do this in a way where certain people are not carrying so much more of the burden of the interactive communication? Like, is it just talking about it aloud?
Well, I think it is trying to foster an environment where helping people understand things like that is normalized. Where people feel, because, to your point, if you just simply read that woman the riot act in the moment, she probably wouldn't get a thing out of it.
No.
She would make it all about you. She would make it, oh, this person is just uptight and this and that and blah, 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 blah. But instead, if you were somehow able to have a high trust conversation with her, specifically, do you realize how that made me feel? She would probably be mortified.
I mean, as someone who openly admits that I got all my Jewish friends' Christmas presents my freshman year because I was so ignorant going into college, I did not know that there were certain people on earth that didn't celebrate Christmas. I get it. Like, I say things all the time that I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe I used to think that. So it is all of us.
But that is such a great example, though, of why those agreements matter so much. Because, one of your Jewish friends that you gave a Christmas present to probably wasn't offended at all and thought it was funny, and it was just totally like, okay, that's Mary Sharon.
Yes, his name was Jason Kravitz. And just to build on that, I then said to him, because I was so flustered, I'm like, well, you got me a Christmas present. And he goes, Yes, because you celebrate Christmas. And then I wanted to just evaporate into thin air and blow away.
And then there was probably another one who thought that was deeply offensive.
Oh, for sure.
Like, how could you?
For sure.
But you know what your intentions were, and your intentions were definitely not to offend, not to anything. But this is where creating an environment where you can actually have that dialogue. Because if you have that dialogue with the person who was offended, actually, you both end up learning something. That person learned that maybe they rushed to judgment a little too quickly by trying to divine your intentions. Mm-hmm. And you would realize, oh my gosh, there's something I just learned that I didn't know before, and I won't make that mistake again.
Well, it also opens the door for them to see who I really am in terms of my own character. And it's like, I was obviously mortified for so many reasons, by the way, so many reasons. But I think it allows them to actually see who I am as well.
Yes.
How do we make it so that there is an actual benefit for everyone to be in the office, not just a benefit for the people who have the least to lose or the least burden to carry?
I think it involves a couple of things. I think one is doing the work to actually create an environment that feels more comfortable and more inviting than hiding behind the screen.
But what does that look like? Is that you having a meeting with your direct? I'm going to be very specific just for the sake of helping people to think through, or even inviting further conversation on this topic. Is that you having a meeting with your directs and saying, hey, I'm a white guy, so I could be off base here, but I'm hearing a lot of legitimate concerns about people not wanting to come to the office, not because they love to work in their pajamas, not because they're just too sensitive to be grown-ups and go to work, but actually I'm concerned that the interactions are having such an adverse effect on them that they're actually not going to be as productive. They're actually going to be less productive, which means as an organization, we will be reaching less of our potential potentially. Do you just like kick it off and invite your leadership team to weigh in? Like, how do you introduce some of these topics that happen on social media and they happen, outside of work? How do you bring that into work in a way that is okay, that you're not completely putting yourself at risk for either?
The first part is just creating an expectation on that leadership team that this is what our true focus is.
But do you bring it up first? Like, do you say, hey, this is what I'm hearing, I'd like for us to solve it? Or do you just kind of wait for people on the team to bring it up?
Oh, I'll go right there. It won't work if you don't have the environment where people not only know that this stuff is okay to talk about, but that we want to talk about it. It's about setting that expectation that I know you probably think our documented goals or our strategy or whatever is the most important thing you do, but it's not. It's hiring and developing the best is what your job is. And you can't do that if people don't feel comfortable at work, if people don't feel like they can do their best work. And again, that sounds platitudinal. I'll just make it simple. If people don't feel like they can share what they really think, that's really what it comes down to.
I think that's
if I can't say what I think, if I feel like it's risky to submit a new idea, if I feel like it's risky to point something out, if I think it's risky to say, I know we've been doing it this way for 15 years, but I think it's wrong.
Right.
Then you're depriving the team and the organization of critical information because you didn't do the work to set up an environment where people could feel comfortable doing that. And once the team understands that that's a priority, then bringing up things like what you're talking about should be as straightforward and as routine as bringing up hey, we're seeing bugs in this specific cycle where this job is taking twice as long or whatever. This thing that's going on is getting in the way of this team reaching its full potential. So what are we going to do?
Thank you for listening. We'd love to continue the conversation anytime inspiration finds you at M Share Studio.